War is a story told in explosions. It is the story of tanks that punch through defensive lines, of bombers that darken the sky, and of battleships that trade broadsides in the vast, unforgiving ocean. We measure it in steel, in courage, and in casualties. But beneath this loud, violent surface there is another war, a silent, invisible conflict fought not with bullets, but with kilowatts, not with soldiers, but with engineers, not in trenches, but inside mountains. This is the story of a weapon so crucial to Allied victory that for decades, its very existence was denied. And it's not the weapon you think it is. It wasn't a bomb, a plane, or a code machine. It was the power source that fed it. This is the story of how an army of engineers, miners, and soldiers, working in total secrecy in one of the most remote places on Earth, built an impossible power plant, hidden from the sky, to fuel a machine that would change the course of the war. Welcome to War Chronicles. The battle you are about to witness was a triumph of engineering and a masterclass in secrecy. Before we break ground on this hidden marvel, make sure you are subscribed. Hit that like button if you appreciate the unsung heroes of the war, and let us know in the comments what country and city you are watching from. We love seeing how far these secret histories travel. Now, prepare for total blackout. We're going dark. The year is 1941. The lights are going out all over Europe, and in the dark, a new predator reigns supreme, the North Atlantic. This, more than any other battlefield, is the artery of the Allied war effort. It is the vital conveyor belt carrying food, fuel, bombs, and men from the United States and Canada to Great Britain. And it is a slaughterhouse. Admiral Donitz's U-boat wolfpacks are strangling the life out of Britain. The air gap, that vast, lonely stretch of mid-ocean, is a killing field, beyond the range of land-based Allied aircraft. Convoys, collections of slow-moving, heavily laden merchant ships, are picked off at will. The Bismarck has just been sunk, yes, but the victory feels hollow as the tonnage reports come in. In April 1941 alone, nearly 700 Zero-Zedran tons of Allied shipping are sent to the bottom. The math is brutal and simple. Britain is starving. The war machine is sputtering. If the U-boats are not stopped, the war is lost. In a damp, smoke-filled office in Whitehall, the problem is laid bare. The Royal Navy's ASW, or anti-submarine warfare, is a desperate, reactive game of cat and mouse, played blind. They have sonar, ASDIC, but it's a close-range weapon. They need to see. They need something that can spot a U-boat's periscope or the wake of a surfaced submarine from miles away, in the dark, in a storm. The request goes out to the nation's finest minds, the scientists working in frantic, brilliant secrecy. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern, a group of eccentric geniuses who had already mastered the art of seeing aircraft with radio waves, radar, are given the impossible task. Find a U-boat in the Atlantic. A young physicist, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who will never be known to history, steps forward with a theory. The current radar, chain-home, is a blunt instrument. Its long wavelengths are perfect for spotting big, high-flying bombers. But to see something as small as a periscope, something that barely breaks the surface of the water, you need a different kind of energy. You need microwaves. You need incredibly short, high-energy pulses, concentrated into a beam so fine it can paint a target the size of a dinner plate. He calls his theoretical device the microwave scanning array. The military brass are skeptical. How can such a device even be built? But the desperation is too great. They give him the green light. Finch and his team work for 6 months, sleeping in their labs, living on stale tea and adrenaline. They create a working prototype. The cavity magnetron, a device that can generate the massive power needed, is a miracle. They mount their new, smaller radar on the nose of a Wellington bomber. The first test flight off the coast of Ireland is a revelation. They fly into a storm. The sea is a mess of whitecaps. The old radar is useless, a screen full of clutter. Then they switch on Finch's device. The screen for a second goes clear, and then, blip. A single, sharp, bright point of light, 15 miles away. The pilot, his voice trembling, calls it in. They fly to the coordinates, and there, in the churning gray sea, is the unmistakable, sinister shape of a Type 7 U-boat, surfaced, charging its batteries. They drop their depth charges. They get a confirmed kill. The Viper's Ear, as the pilots come to call it, is born. It is the hidden weapon. It is the key to the Atlantic. Churchill is told. The order is given. Build them. Build 1,000 of them. Put them on every ship, every plane. Now. But then, Dr. Finch, the quiet, unassuming physicist, presents the real problem. The problem that is bigger than the U-boats. The Viper's Ear works. It works too well. A single array, just one, consumes more electricity than a small town. The cavity magnetron is a power-hungry dragon. To mount one on a ship is feasible, running it off the destroyer's main turbines. But the real plan, the one that could win the war, is not just to mount them on planes. The plan is to build a wall, a Viper's fence, a chain of massive, high-powered, long-range Viper's Ear stations along the entire coast of Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and Iceland. A radar fence so powerful it could watch the entire air gap from land. It would see every U-boat, every Focke-Wulf Condor, every raider, the moment it left its base in Norway or France. But to power this fence, to feed this continental-sized array, Finch lays the numbers on the table. It would require a stable, continuous, and colossal amount of electricity, more than the entire Scottish electrical grid could provide. If they tried, they would black out northern Britain. And the first time they caused a blackout, the first time a German intelligence analyst in Berlin noticed that the entire city of Glasgow went dark every time a convoy sailed, the secret would be out. "Gentlemen," Finch says, his voice quiet, "you cannot build your weapon, because you cannot power it, not without a power source that the enemy cannot see, cannot find, and cannot even guess exists." The room is silent. The greatest weapon of the war, the key to survival, is sitting on a workbench, useless, because they can't plug it in. The silence in the Whitehall briefing room was as thick and cold as the London fog outside. The military men, an air marshal and a rear admiral, looked at Dr. Finch with a mixture of awe and profound frustration. They had just been shown the key to salvation, only to be told the door was locked. "This is a joke, isn't it?" the air marshal barked, his face red. "You've built us a sword, Dr. Finch, but you're telling us we can't lift it?" "I am telling you, sir," Finch replied, his voice strained, "that if you try to lift this sword, you will alert the entire German military. The moment you power this fence, the voltage drop on the national grid will be a beacon. They'll know where we are, and they'll know what we're doing. They will bomb the source, and the secret will be out. The weapon will be useless." The rear admiral, a man whose entire world was the Atlantic convoy routes, slammed his fist on the oaken table. "So that's it? We're to tell the Prime Minister that we are letting Britain starve because of an engineering problem, because of a bloody plug socket?" "It is not a socket, Admiral," a new voice said, cutting through the tension. The voice was quiet, measured, and carried the soft, rolling burr of the Scottish Highlands. All eyes turned to a man sitting in the corner, a man no one had paid any attention to. He was not in uniform. He wore a rumpled tweed suit. His face was lined with exhaustion, and a set of blueprints was rolled up on his lap. This was Ardal McEwen, the chief engineer for the Scottish Hydroelectric Board, on secondment to the Ministry of Supply. He had been invited to this meeting as an afterthought, a consultant on grid logistics. McEwen unrolled his blueprint. It wasn't a wiring diagram, it was a topographical map. "Admiral," McEwen said, standing and walking to the table, his presence suddenly filling the room. "You are correct. This is an engineering problem, and it requires an engineering solution. You need a power plant, a plant that generates over 200 megawatts, continuously, a plant that is invisible, a plant that is bomb-proof, a plant that does not exist." "Your point, Mr. McEwen?" the air marshal said impatiently. "My point, sir, is that we must build it, and we must build it where no one would ever think to look." He tapped the map. The location was in the far northwest of Scotland, a desolate, windswept and almost uninhabited patch of granite and peat bog. The name on the map was Ben Gair, Gair Mountain. and next to it a long, dark finger of water. Loch Gare. "It's a mountain, McEwen," the admiral said, squinting. "What good is a mountain?" "It is a battery," McEwen said, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. Loch Gare is over 2,000 feet above sea level. It is a massive natural reservoir, fed by 1,000 square miles of Scottish rain. It is a battery, gentlemen, just waiting to be tapped. "A hydroelectric dam," Finch surmised, his physicist's brain catching on. "But, Mr. McEwen, the visibility, a dam, the construction. The Luftwaffe will see it in a week. They'll bomb it to rubble before the concrete is even dry." "Who said anything about a dam?" McEwen said, a slow, grim smile spreading. He unrolled a second blueprint. This one was a cross-section. It showed Ben Gare, the mountain, and the loch above it. But it also showed a void. "We will not build on the mountain," McEwen explained, his finger tracing a line. "We will build inside it. We will drill a tunnel, a pressure shaft, 15 feet wide, straight down from the floor of the loch. We will drop that water 2,000 vertical feet. We will excavate a cavern here. A cathedral, built of granite, 1/4 of a mile inside the mountain. In that cavern, we will build our turbine hall. We will house 6 of the largest Pelton turbines ever conceived. The water, having spent its energy, will then be discharged through a 2-mile-long tail race tunnel, emptying. Here." He tapped the map again. "Into the Atlantic, 200 feet below the surface of the sea, in a deep, tidal-swept cove. No dam, no building, no new roads. The only thing visible from the sky will be the transmission lines, and we will run those lines, not on great obvious pylons, but buried in trenches, or disguised along the natural contours of the glens, all the way to the coastal sites where Dr. Finch will build his Viper's fence. The construction itself, we will call it a mine, a Royal Ordnance lead mine. The granite we excavate will be dumped into the sea, where the tide will wash it away. We will work under camouflage netting. We will work in the dark. We will, quite literally, move a mountain, and no one will ever know." The room was staggered. The sheer, colossal, pharaonic scale of the idea was too much. "Mr. McEwen," the admiral said, his voice Hewson, that is impossible. It's a fantasy. A project of that scale? It would take 10 years. The war will be over by then." McEwen looked the admiral in the eye. "My son was a radio operator on the SS City of Benares. He was torpedoed and drowned 600 miles from land. The war, Admiral, will be over in 1 year. If we lose the Atlantic." He paused, his own grief a palpable force. "It will not take 10 years. You give me what I ask. You give me 10,000 men. You give me the Royal Canadian Engineers, the best tunnelers in the world. You give me the Polish Free Forces for security. You give me priority on all steel, all copper, all cement. You give me the authority to seize this land. You give me that. And I will give you your power plant in 24 months. 24 months! The air marshal exploded. 18, McEwen said, his voice a low growl. 18 months, or my son and all the others died for nothing. Gentlemen, you need a secret weapon. I will build you the secret forge to make it." There were no other options. The problem had been stated. The solution, as insane as it sounded, was the only one on the table. The rear admiral looked at the air marshal. The air marshal looked at Dr. Finch. Finch simply nodded, his mind already calculating the megawatts. A phone was picked up. A call was made to number 10. The plan was explained in hushed, urgent tones. The Prime Minister's reply was, as always, brief and to the point. "Make the mountain give up its power, Mr. McEwen. The King's enemies await." Project Gare, as it was codenamed, was born. It would be a battle fought not against men, but against time, against the hardest granite in the world, and against the crushing, soul-destroying secrecy that it demanded. Ardal McEwen, a civilian engineer, was now the general of the most important and most invisible battlefield of the war. His army would be an army of tunnel tigers, miners from Wales and Cornwall, Canadian lumberjacks, and Polish soldiers who had lost their own country. Their enemy was the mountain itself, and their deadline was the survival of the Allied world. The invasion began not with a bombardment, but with a whisper. In the harsh, rain-lashed spring of 1942, the region around Ben Ger, a place of 10 Wanderen sheep and less than 100 people, was sealed. It was not a polite request. It was a military occupation. Trucks, painted in drab olive, rumbled up the narrow, single-track glens, their engines grinding. The few shepherds who lived in stone crofts, who measured their lives by the seasons, were given 48 hours to evacuate. Their land, their history, was seized by the War Office under the Defense of the Realm Act. Then came the Guards. They were not British. They were the men of the Polish Free Forces, men who had seen their own country erased from the map, men who understood the terrible final price of failure. They were hard, silent, and utterly loyal. Their orders were simple: no one in, no one out. This 500-square-mile patch of Scotland was now a dead zone. They shot sheep who wandered too close to the perimeter, and the rumors in the distant pubs were that they would do the same to any man. They were the perfect, terrifying curtain. Behind this curtain, Ardal McEwen's army arrived. They were the shadow men of the industrial world. They were not soldiers, but they were fighters. They were the tunnel tigers from the slate quarries of Wales, men who could read a rock face like a book. They were Irish navvies, with arms thick as an anchor chain, who could swing a pick for 18 hours straight. And, most critically, they were 2,000 men from the Royal Canadian Engineers, lumberjacks and hard rock miners from the vast, frozen wilderness of the Canadian Shield, men who knew how to fight mountains and win. They were told they were building Ranelm, the Royal Ordnance Naval Ammunition and Lead Mine, a deep-level bunker and mine, a strategic reserve. The lie was plausible. It was just believable enough. But even the lie didn't explain the scale. Their barracks were not wooden huts, but Nissen huts, half buried in the peat and covered with camouflage netting, invisible from 500 feet. All work stopped instantly at the sound of an aircraft engine. The no-go zone was absolute. Mail was censored, both in and out. The men were forbidden from a single word of their mine work. They were prisoners, in all but name, on a battlefield of their own. Ardal McEwen was there from the first day, his tweed suit replaced by oilskins and a hard hat. He lived in a Nissen hut identical to his men's. His son's photograph was the only personal item on his desk. He was a man possessed, driven by a grief that had calcified into a diamond-hard resolve. He was not just building a power plant. He was building a monument. He was building the weapon that would have saved his boy. The first cut was into the side of Ben Ger, the opening for the 2-mile tail race tunnel, the back door of the operation. The men stood before the sheer granite cliff, the wind and rain a constant horizontal assault. This was not sedimentary rock. This was Louisian gneiss, the oldest, hardest rock in the world, 3 million years of compressed, interlocking crystal. When the first pneumatic drills bit into the rock, the sound was not a cut, but a high-pitched metallic scream. The drills, the hardest tungsten carbide bits, shattered. They would drill for an hour and blunt a dozen bits just to gain an inch. "This ain't rock," a Welsh miner, a foreman named Taffy Evans, spat, the granite dust already caked on his face. "This is the devil's own bloody jaw." McEwen was right there. "Then we will break his teeth," he said, his voice flat. "Dynamite. We go by the Swedish method. Drill and blast. 10-foot sections. We will not cut this mountain. We will explode our way through it." And so the rhythm of Project Ger was set. It was a 24-hour cycle of hell. Drill, blast. Choke on the dust and the cordite fumes. Shovel the shattered rock, the muck, into carts. Lay a few feet of track. And then drill, blast, choke, shovel, again. They were working in 3 8-hour shifts around the clock. The mountain was lit 24/7 by the harsh yellow glare of construction lights, all of it shielded from the sky. The sound was a constant. Percussive thump, thump, thump of the drills and the intermittent ground-shaking crump of the dynamite, a sound that became their heartbeat, and the mountain fought back. The granite was not uniform. It was riddled with faults, dikes, and sills, geological traps. In the third week, Taffy Evans's crew was drilling when they hit a pocket of water, a pressurized fissure. The hole they were drilling exploded, a geyser of 60-degree stone-cold water that knocked the men from their platform. The tunnel flooded, waist-deep, in minutes. It took them 2 days to pump it out. 2 months in, the first death. A misfire. A charge that didn't go off. A young Canadian, barely 19, went back to check the line. The charge blew, and the resulting rockfall buried him. They didn't recover the body. He was, as the miner's grim phrase went, buried in the mountain. McEwen himself wrote the letter to the boy's mother in Saskatchewan. He told her son had died in a training accident. It was a lie that poisoned his soul. While the tail race tunnel, the exit, was being bored toward the sea, a second, more terrifying operation began. The main cavern, the cathedral. A new shaft was sunk, a massive, vertical, 60-foot-wide abyss, straight down, a quarter-mile into the mountain's core. From the bottom of this shaft, the Canadian and Welsh tunnelers began to excavate, blasting in every direction. They were carving out the turbine hall. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They were making a room, a man-made cave, 700 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 120 feet high, out of solid billion-year-old rock. The noise in this cavern was a living thing. It was a cacophony of drills, generators, and the constant deafening roar of the massive ventilation fans, sucking out the toxic dynamite fumes and the suffocating granite dust that hung in the air, a permanent choking fog. Men developed the cough. Their lungs were filling with the mountain. But the most dangerous job of all was not the tail race. It was not the cavern. It was the pressure shaft. This was the artery, the tunnel that had to be bored upward. From the roof of the newly excavated cavern, a team of vertical tigers, the most fearless or the most crazy of the Canadian engineers, began to drill a 15-foot-wide shaft, 2.00 vertical feet, to connect with the bottom of Loch Gare. This was a new kind of terror. They were drilling blind, toward a multi-billion-ton weight of water. Every time they drilled, every time they set a charge, they knew they were getting closer to the cold, dark, crushing weight of the loch. "You don't just hear the drills up there," one of the men said, his hands shaking as he held a mug of tea. You can feel the water. The rock is wet. It's cold. It feels like we're not drilling into a mountain. It feels like we're drilling a hole in the bottom of a battleship, from the inside. McEwen was obsessed with the pressure shaft. It was the key. He would stand at the bottom, in the cavern, sheets of water running down the walls, and stare up into the dark vertical hole, as if he could will it into existence. "They're too slow, Taffy," McEwen said, his voice raw with exhaustion. "They're drilling into a bloody lake, Ardal." Taffy Evans shouted back, the only man who dared use the chief's first name. "We hit one major fault, one bad fissure, and that entire loch will come down on our heads. It'll be the fastest, and the last wash and brush up we ever have. We can't rush this." And the secrecy, the paranoia, it was constant. The tail race tunnel, as it approached the sea, became the most sensitive point. The muck, the thousands of tons of shattered granite couldn't just be piled on the shore. A Luftwaffe plane would see spoil heap in a day and know this was no mine. So, McEwen devised a plan. The tunnel broke through to the sea in a deep, sheer-sided cove. But it broke through below the high tide mark. The minecarts, running on their tracks, would go to the very end, dump their load of shattered rock into the sea, and back up. But they could only do it at high tide, and at night, when the tidal currents were at their strongest. The rock vanished, pulled out into the deep Atlantic, washed away, scoured, leaving no trace. 250,000 tons of granite, disposed of, in total silence, by the moon and the tide. One night, a Ju-88, a German reconnaissance bomber, flying high on a stray patrol, crossed the coast. On the mountain, the order "Sky Eye" was screamed. Every light, every engine, every drill was cut. Instantly, The entire, massive 10,000-man operation plunged into absolute silence and darkness. The men in the cavern, a quarter-mile down, felt the generators cut out. They were plunged into a terrifying, absolute, and tomb-like blackness, the only sound the drip, drip, drip of the mountain weeping around them. The plane, its engines a faint, menacing drone, passed overhead. It saw nothing. Just a lightless, desolate, rain-swept mountain. It flew on. After 10 minutes, the generators whirred back to life. The lights flickered on. The men, their faces pale, looked at each other. No one spoke. They just picked up their tools and went back to work. The mountain was being hollowed. The forge was being built. But the cost was mounting. By the 10th month, 28 men were dead, buried in the mountain. And the deadline, 18 months, was looming. The war in the Atlantic was at its absolute zenith. The Viper's Fence was just a theory, and Dr. Finch was waiting, desperately, for his power. After 14 months of ceaseless, deafening, and soul-crushing labor, the drilling stopped. The silence, when it finally came, was a shock. It was a terrifying, profound, and heavy quiet, broken only by the steady drip, 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 of water seeping from 3-billion-year-old rock and the distant hollow roar of the ventilation fans. The cathedral, the vast man-made cavern a quarter-mile inside Ben Ger, was complete. The men who had blasted it into existence stood in the vast, damp darkness, their helmet lamps barely penetrating the gloom. They had created a void, a space so enormous that the first Nissen hut they built inside it, for the engineers, looked like a child's toy. The air was cold, smelling of wet stone and ozone. It was a place of awe. Ardell McEwen stood on an outcropping of rock, looking at his creation. He had hollowed the mountain, but the victory felt incomplete. "It's a tomb, Ardell," Taffy Evans said. His voice, now that he wasn't shouting over the drills, was a low rumble. "We've built a fine, grand tomb." "Not a tomb, Taffy," McEwen said, his eyes tracing the steel girders already being bolted into the cavern roof. "A forge, and now we bring in the heart." The heart was, in fact, 6 hearts. 6 massive, 60,000 horsepower Pelton turbines and their accompanying generators, transformers, and switchgear. This was the new, impossible problem. The logistics of the excavation had been a nightmare of secrecy. The logistics of the installation were a nightmare of physics. How do you move components the size of a house, weighing over 100 tons, from factories in England, up a narrow, winding Scottish glen, and install them inside a mountain, without a single German reconnaissance plane noticing? The Luftwaffe was not stupid. Their eyes were constantly scanning the coast. A 100-ton generator stator, sitting on a flatbed truck, is not something you can cover with a canvas sheet and pass off as farming equipment. The main road to the site was watched. McEwen, Dr. Finch, and the men from the Ministry of Supply met in the new office hut deep inside the mountain. The mood was grim. "The parts are ready," the ministry man said, wringing his hands. "They are. Large, very large. The main transformers had to be custom-built by English Electric. The turbine runners, the wheels themselves, are 20 feet across. We cannot move them. Not on those roads. Not in daylight. Not without being seen." "Then we will not move them in daylight," McEwen said. "Mr. McEwen, even at night," the man insisted. "A convoy of that size. The noise, the sheer weight. It will destroy the roads. It will be seen. It's impossible." "The word impossible," McEwen said, his voice deadly quiet, "has been retired from this project. We have adjusted to the local conditions." He turned to a new blueprint. "We will not bring them in whole." The plan was as brilliant as it was risky. The components were not shipped whole. McEwen had forced the manufacturers, to their great protest, to design the generators and turbines in modular sections. The main generator stators were built in 4 25-ton quarters, designed to be bolted together, with tolerances of 1/1000 of an inch, on site. The massive turbine runners were shipped in halves. Everything was broken down. The lie of Ranelagh, the Royal Ordnance naval ammunition and lead mine, was now their greatest asset. The components began to arrive at the railhead 20 miles away. They were in massive, unmarked wooden crates, sealed with tar. The shipping manifests were a masterpiece of disinformation, signed by Dr. Finch himself. High-frequency radio array components, atmospheric condensers, naval pump housings, plausible, technical, and utterly boring. But the real challenge was the final 20 miles, the winding, single-track road up the glen. For this, McEwen relied on his Polish guards and the cover of God. The components moved only on the nights of the worst, most foul, dreich Scottish weather. They waited for the new moon, for the horizontal rain, for the gale-force winds that screamed down from the high tops. The weather that kept the Luftwaffe on the ground in Norway was the weather that brought the Harridan's power to life. The operation was a slow, agonizing crawl. A convoy of Scammell Pioneer trucks, the most powerful haulers in the British Army, would wait for the signal. The signal was a single coded radio message from the RAF. North Atlantic clear, no flights. At 22, New 0 hours, the convoy would move, no headlights, not even the pinprick blackout lights. The drivers, all of them hand-picked veterans, drove by memory, and by the light of a single man, a Polish soldier, walking 20 feet in front of the truck, his face wrapped in a scarf, holding a small downward-pointing lantern. The sound of the massive diesel engines, grinding in low gear, was masked by the shriek of the wind and the roar of the rain. Polish guards lined the entire 20-mile route, one man every 100 yards, armed with Sten guns, ensuring not a single shepherd, not a single stray, saw the ghost convoy pass. The trucks, carrying their 25-ton sections of agricultural machinery, would arrive at the camouflage tunnel entrance, the tail race, at 03:00. By 04:00, the cargo was underground, lowered by a massive gantry crane, also built inside the mountain, down the main shaft and into the cathedral. By 05:00, the trucks were gone, their tire tracks washed away by the rain. By sunrise, the glen was empty, just the wind and the sheep. And inside the mountain, the Second Army took over. These were not the tunnel tigers. These were the shadow engineers. Men from the factories, the foremen and technicians from English Electric, from Boving, from the great shipyards of the Clyde. They were the men who understood tolerances, who knew how to sweat a bearing and balance a rotor. They had been told they were building a strategic bomb-proof power station for a new secret naval base. The lie held. They were now the prisoners of Ben Ger, and in the cold, damp, yellow-lit air of the cathedral, they began to build the heart. It was a surreal, almost religious scene. In this vast, granite-walled cavern, welding sparks, brilliant blue and white, arced in the darkness, illuminating the faces of the engineers as they meticulously bolted the generator quarters together. The massive 20-foot-tall turbine runners were assembled piece by piece, their stainless steel buckets polished to a mirror shine. The air, which had for a year been filled with the stench of cordite, now smelled of hot metal, lubricating oil, and welding flux. Ardal McEwen was everywhere. He was no longer a civil engineer. He was a conductor, orchestrating the most complex high-stakes assembly in the world. He watched as the 6 massive 40-ton generator rotors, the magnets, were lowered, inch by agonizing inch, into the wound copper nests of the stators. A mistake of a millimeter, a single moment of imbalance, would at 3 or 0 RPM tear the entire plant apart. Gently, he would whisper, his hands conducting the crane operator. Gently, as if you're laying a child to sleep. While the machines were being assembled, the final, most terrifying piece of the puzzle had to be put in place. The pressure shaft. The 2,000-foot vertical tunnel was drilled, lined with steel, and ready. But it was still below the lock. A 30-foot thick plug of solid granite at the bottom of Loch Ger was the only thing holding back billions of gallons of water. This was the final act of the Tunnel Tigers. Taffy Evans and his best, most experienced crew were given the job. They drilled into this plug. From below, they packed it with over 2 tons of dynamite, This is the one, Ardal, Taffy said, his face pale, checking the detonator wires. When we blow this, there's no going back. If your steel lining ain't right, if our calculations are off by a poof, that lock will come down and fill this mountain, this cathedral. In about 30 seconds, we'll all be drowned rats. McEwen looked at the 6 generators, now assembled, gleaming silent gods of metal. He looked at the vast, empty cavern. He looked at Taffy. The war won't wait, Mr. Evans. The men in the Atlantic are drowning now. He paused. Send your men to the surface. You and I will press the plunger. Taffy looked at him, a civilian, a desk man. No, Ardal. This one's on me. It's a miner's job. Get to a safe distance. McEwen shook his head. This is my son's forge, Taffy. We do it together. They cleared the mountain. The 10 Zeuaren men were evacuated for the first time to the surface on the pretense of a gas leak drill. At 16-0 in the cavern, now empty save for 2 men and the 6 silent turbines, Taffy Evans and Ardal McEwen stood at the detonator a quarter-mile from the base of the shaft. May God forgive us if we're wrong, Taffy whispered. May he forgive us if we're too late, McEwen replied. Together they pushed the handle. There was no sound at first, just a deep, profound tremor, a vibration that shook their teeth, and then a sound. A sound that was not a sound. It was a feeling. A low, gut-vibrating, all-encompassing roar, like a dragon awakening. It was the sound of 1 billion tons of water, the entire weight of Loch Gair, finally unleashed, falling 2,000 feet, screaming down the pressure shaft. The ground shook. The lights in the cavern flickered. A cloud of rock dust and compressed air blew out of the shaft, and then the roar stabilized. It became a steady, deafening hiss. Taffy Evans was crying, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on his face. Ardal McEwen closed his eyes. He could feel it. The raw, untamed, colossal power of the Scottish Highlands, now trapped in a steel pipe, hammering against the closed inlet valves of his turbines. The mountain was alive. The forge was ready. The blast that breached the lock had settled, but the roar it unleashed was now a permanent, living presence. It was the sound of a contained ocean. 2,000 feet above, Loch Gair, cold, dark, and unimaginably heavy, was now pressing down, funneling its ancient kinetic anger into 6 steel-lined penstocks. The water hammered against the main inlet valves. Great, 30-ton discs of solid steel that were the only thing separating the calm of the cathedral from the fury of the mountain. The tunnel tigers and the shadow engineers had done their job. The cavern was built, the machines were assembled. Now it was time for the Third Army, the men who understood the invisible, lethal magic of electricity. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived, and he brought his sparks, the high-voltage engineers from the Ministry of Supply, the men who spoke a different language, one of circuits, phases, and loads. To them, the vast, gleaming 60-megawatt generators were not just machines. They were sleeping gods, and their job was to wake them up. Ardal McEwen, his work as a builder done, now stood as an observer. His creation, his forge, was about to be lit. He watched as Finch's men, small and precise, moved around the massive switchgear, checking connections, calibrating dials. They were men in rubber-soled boots, who never touched metal with 2 hands at once, who respected the 275, 00 volts they were about to unleash as a soldier respects a live bomb. All right, Mr. McEwen, Finch said, his voice quiet, almost reverent, in the echoing cavern. She's a magnificent forge. Now, let's see if she can make lightning. The process was slow, methodical. This was not a single switch. It was a symphony of small, precise acts. The cathedral was cleared. Only the essential crew remained. McEwen stood with Finch in the new glass-walled control room, built high on the cavern wall, looking down on the 6 silent turbines. Turbine 1, Finch said into a microphone. Open the main inlet valve, 10%. A young engineer strapped into a safety harness turned a heavy red wheel. A deep hydraulic groan echoed through the cavern, and then a new sound, a sound that cut through the steady hiss of the penstocks. It was a high-pitched metallic scream, the sound of 10,000 gallons of water per second striking the 20-foot-wide steel buckets of the Pelton runner. The 40-ton rotor, which had been static, began to turn, slowly at first. A majestic, terrifying rotation, then faster and faster. "She's spinning, sir," the engineer shouted, his voice cracking. "RPM's rising. 50, 100. "Bring her to 500 RPM, Finch ordered, his eyes glued to the dials. "Synchronize." The generator was now a living thing, a spinning 40-ton magnet, generating a low, gut-vibrating whine that built in pitch and volume. The floor of the control room trembled. The air in the cavern crackled. The lights flickered as the auxiliary power was strained. "She's at 500 RPM, stable," the engineer reported. "Good," Finch said. He wiped his palms, which were sweating. "Now, the exciter. Put the field on the line." This was the moment. The exciter was the smaller generator that would send the initial massive jolt of electricity into the copper windings of the main rotor, turning the 40-ton spinning magnet into a true electromagnet. This was the act of making the power. Field on now. There was a loud metallic clack thump from the switchgear, and the sound of the generator changed. The low whine became an angry, solid roar. The needles on the voltmeters, which had been at 0, leapt across the dials. They were generating. They were making 12 volts. "She's on the line, sir!" the engineer cried, his voice full of awe. She's beautiful!" One by one, over the next 4 hours, the other 5 generators were brought to life. The cathedral was no longer a cold, damp cavern. It was a living, breathing, thundering heart. The noise was overwhelming, a solid wall of sound, the combined synchronized roar of 660,000 horsepower turbines, all spinning at exactly 500 RPM, all generating a combined 360 megawatts of raw, stable, invisible power. The air was hot, thick with the smell of ozone. "Mr. McEwen!" Finch shouted over the din, a wild, manic grin on his face. "You've done it! You've tamed the mountain!" "We've woken it, Dr. Finch," McEwen shouted back, his own face a mask of triumph. "Now, where does all this anger, go?" "It goes," Finch said, pointing to the roof, "to the transformers, and then to the coast." This was the second half of the secret. The power plant was the heart. The Viper's fence was the teeth. While McEwen had been building his forge, Dr. Finch had been building his weapon. All along the western coast of Scotland, in the remote Orkney and Shetland Islands, in the fjords of Iceland, a new, strange construction had appeared. To any German reconnaissance plane, they looked like simple coastal radar stations, the same kind the British had been building for years. Large, ugly, but familiar. This, too, was a lie. The dishes were a distraction. The real weapon was hidden. In bunkers dug into the cliffs, Finch's teams had installed the Viper's Ear arrays. Not the small, aircraft-sized ones, but massive 100-foot-long linear arrays, aimed like fixed rifles at the North Atlantic at the Gap. These were not just radar. They were too powerful. They were designed to be fed the entire colossal 360-megawatt output of Ben Ghar. "The power," Finch explained to a baffled RAF general, "is not for listening, General. It's for shouting. We are not just going to find the U-boats. We are going to boil them." This was the weapon's true, terrifying secret. The Viper's fence was not a passive detector. It was an active, offensive weapon. It was the world's first and largest microwave oven. The plan was simple. When a convoy entered the Gap, Ben Ghar would power up. The entire output of the mountain, 360 megawatts, would be fed, through the disguised, buried transmission lines, to the Viper's fence. For a period of 5 minutes, the arrays would unleash a focused, continental-sized beam of high-energy microwaves. Any U-boat, any piece of metal within that beam would be affected. The water in the ocean will not be heated, Finch explained, as if lecturing a student. It is too vast. But a U-boat, sir. A sealed metal tube, full of wires, torpedoes, a radio mast, a periscope, all that metal, floating in a conductive saline solution, will act as a perfect antenna. The microwaves will induce a current, a massive, catastrophic, uncontrolled electrical current. What? What does that mean, Finch? The general asked. It means, sir, Finch said, his eyes cold, that for the men inside, the air will become unbreathable, full of poison gas from the batteries which will instantly overload. It means any exposed metal, like a periscope handwheel or a radio headset, will become hot enough to melt flesh or skin. It means their torpedoes, which are electrically primed, might cook off. It means, General, that we are turning their own submarines into self-destructing electrical traps. We are. Ringing the dinner bell. And now, in the thundering ozone-filled cathedral, it was time for the first test. The date was November 19th, 1943. A convoy, SC-147, was entering the gap. German intelligence from a spy in Halifax had alerted the Wolfpacks. Dönitz had assigned 10 U-boats to Operation Thunder, a massive coordinated attack. The Atlantic was, as always, a killing field. But this time, it was a trap. In the control room at Ben Guer, a red light blinked. It was a secure teletype, direct from Whitehall. The message was one word: ring. Mr. McEwen, Finch said, his voice trembling. Your forge, full power, now. McEwen, the man who had only ever built things, now had to unleash one. He stood at the main switchboard. It was a massive, 20-foot-long panel of black bakelite, covered in dials and levers. The main breaker was a lever as thick as a man's arm. He looked at Finch. Finch nodded. McEwen gripped the lever. He pulled. There was a sound like a thunderclap, a wheezed crack, so loud it dwarfed the roar of the turbines. A brilliant blue-white arc, a man-made lightning bolt, leapt across the main contacts. As 360 megawatts of power, the full, raw, untamed fury of Loch Gair, was shunted from the generators and sent. The lights in the cathedral dimmed for a second under the colossal sudden load. The generators screamed, a high-pitched metallic howl of protest as the full weight of the work was demanded of them. The entire mountain vibrated. The power was gone. It was not in the mountain anymore. It was traveling at the speed of light, through the buried cables, up the coast, to the Viper's fence. 300 miles away, in a concrete bunker in the Shetland Islands, an RAF operator sat at his Viper's ear array. "Fence is hot, sir," he yelled. "Ben Guer is on the line, full power." "Transmit," his officer ordered. The operator flipped a switch. There was no sound, no explosion, just a faint, high-pitched whine from the massive Klystron tubes. For 5 minutes, the Viper's fence poured 360 megawatts of focused microwave energy into the North Atlantic. In the control room at Ben Guer, the 5 minutes were an eternity. The mountain groaned. The generators howled. The men stood, silent, sweating in the hot, ozone-filled air, as their creation poured its soul into the sea. Then the red light blinked again. "Cease." McEwen slammed the breaker open. Crack! The load was cut. The generators, suddenly released, spun with a whine of relief. The roar of the cavern returned to its normal, steady state. Finch and McEwen looked at each other, breathing heavily. They had done it. They had fired the gun. They waited. For 10 hours they waited. Then the teletype rattled to life. It was a report from an RAF Coastal Command bomber, a Liberator, flying reconnaissance over the convoy's path. The message was in code, but the meaning was clear. Patrol reports. Targets. Neutralized. 9. Repeat. 9. Confirmed contacts. All silent. No movement. No survivors. Sea. Littered with debris. Convoy SC-147. Proceeding. Untouched. The officer in the bunker at Shetland, the one who gave the order, found something else. An ultra-intercept, a frantic, half-garbled message from the 10th U-boat, U-533, which had been on the edge of the beam. The message, sent just before it, too, went silent, was not a tactical report. It was a scream. Fire. Fire in the boat. The air. The air is. Brent. Burning. Got. Hilfy. God help. Finch read the intercept. He looked at McEwen. The triumph on his face was gone, replaced by something else, a cold, profound, and terrible understanding. "Mr. Ruin," Finch whispered, his hands shaking as he held the paper. "Your son is avenged, but, my God, what have we built?" McEwen looked at the 6 massive spinning generators. The forge was lit, and it was hungry. The victory was not celebrated with champagne. It was not marked by triumphant parades. The result of Operation Ring was received at Whitehall not with cheers, but with a cold, profound, and terrified silence. The ultra-intercepts told the story, and it was a story of pure, unadulterated horror. Donitz was blind. His wolf packs, his gray wolves, the most feared predators in the world, were suddenly, inexplicably, dying. The reports from the few U-boats that survived, the ones on the periphery, were incoherent. They were not reports of battle. They were disjointed tales of madness, of phantom fires, of crews suffocating on burning air, of radio operators screaming as their headsets melted to their skulls. The German High Command was thrown into chaos. They grounded their fleets. They executed men for sabotage. They redesigned their batteries, believing their own technology was flawed. They never once, not for a single second, suspected the truth. They never suspected that the Allies had built a forge inside a Scottish mountain to power a weapon that could boil the ocean, and the Allies, in their terror, made the most crucial decision of the war. They stopped. They never, ever fired the Viper's fence at full power again. They had built the ultimate weapon, and they were too afraid to use it. Not out of morality, but out of a cold, strategic calculation. A weapon this effective, this total, was a one-time trick. If they kept vaporizing wolf packs, the Germans, in their desperation, would find the source. They would send 1,000 bombers. They would land commandos. They would copy the technology. The secret was more valuable than the victory. So the Viper's fence changed tactics. It became a ghost. It became a herding dog. No longer was it a 360-megawatt kill switch. Dr. Finch and his Sparks, now understanding the terrible instrument they had built, tuned it. When a convoy approached, the fence would power up, but only to 10%. The effect was no longer lethal. It was psychological. In the U-boats, it was a living nightmare. Captains would report their compasses spinning wildly. Radio operators would get violent, agonizing shocks. The air would taste of metal and ozone. Men would get sick, their teeth aching, their heads pounding. It was a haunting. The gap became known as the Cursed Sea. U-boat morale, once sky-high, collapsed. Captains, the aces of the deep, began to refuse. They would falsify their logs, taking their boats far north or far south, anywhere but the Cursed Sea, where the air itself turned against them. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won with a bang. It was won with a whine, a high-pitched, invisible frequency that drove an entire navy insane. And the forge, Ben Ger, kept its silence. It hummed 24/7, its 6 turbines spinning, its cathedral thundering, a hidden heart pumping its secret power into the war effort, a war effort that did not even know it existed. Then, in 1945, the war ended. Across the world, cities erupted in celebration. But in the shadow of Ben Ger, the silence just deepened. The 10 Zerausorn men who had built the impossible were not given medals. They were not honored in parades. They were, one by one, brought into a debriefing room. They were thanked briefly by a man in an unmarked uniform. They were given their back pay, and they were handed a document, the Official Secrets Act, with a new, terrifying addendum. They were forbidden, for their entire lives, from speaking a single word of Ronald, not the mine, not the mountain, not the tunnels, not the cough that was already settling in their lungs from the granite dust. They were told, in no uncertain terms, that to speak was treason, and the penalty for treason was death. They were the men who had built the forge that won the war, and they were sent home, silent. Taffy Evans, the Welsh foreman, went back to the quarries and died in 1955 from silicosis, his miner's cough, his secret buried with him. The Polish guards, the men who had kept the curtain of secrecy, were repatriated or scattered, their unit lost in the administrative chaos of post-war Europe. The Viper's fence, the coastal arrays were dismantled. The bunkers were filled with concrete, the massive klystron tubes smashed and buried. The sites were given back to the gulls and the wind, their histories erased. Dr. Alistair Finch, the man who had imagined the weapon, did not go home. He simply vanished. His name was expunged. He was folded, seamlessly, into the new Cold War. He went from hunting U-boats to hunting MiGs, his genius for invisible warfare now the most valuable commodity on Earth. He became a ghost, living in the shadow world of signals intelligence he had helped to create. And Ardal McEwen. After VE Day, he stood for the last time in the cathedral. The war was over, the turbines were still spinning, the roar was still deafening. He had built it, he had avenged his son, and the cost was unbearable. He was offered a knighthood, he was offered a place on the new Atomic Energy Board. He was offered fame, wealth, and a position of national importance. He refused. He refused it all. He resigned from the Ministry of Supply. He left Ben Ger, and he never, ever went back. He returned to his small house in the Highlands. He returned to his wife, who had thought him a glorified supply clerk for 4 years. He could not tell her that her husband had hollowed a mountain. He could not tell her that he had built the weapon that avenged their boy. He was bound by the same oath as his men. He lived out his life as a simple civil engineer, designing small bridges and local waterworks. He was known as a quiet, sad man who would, on stormy nights, sit and stare at the sea. He carried the weight of the 28 men buried in his mountain and the thousands boiled in the sea. His victory was total, and his silence was absolute. But what of the power plant? It was too big to destroy. It was too valuable to hide. So, the greatest lie of all was told. In 1950, 5 years after the war, a grand ceremony was held at Ben Ger. The press was invited. The new queen herself attended. The Ben Ger hydroelectric scheme was officially opened. The newspapers celebrated it as a triumph of post-war British engineering, a symbol of the new rebuilt Britain. The stories celebrated the brave men who had started work in 1946. The timeline was a fiction. The purpose was a lie. The cathedral, the true massive turbine hall, was sealed, declared geologically unstable, in the 1970s. A new, smaller, tourist power station was built nearby. Today you can visit Ben Ger. You can see the dam at Loch Ger, a dam that was built after the war to disguise the real hidden intakes. You can read the plaque that tells the official, sanitized, post-war story. But the cathedral is still there, a quarter-mile down. It is dark. It is silent. It is flooded. The 6 great turbines, the hearts that McEwen built, are rusting in a cold, deep Scottish tomb. The forge is cold, but for 18 critical, terrifying months, this secret power plant, this impossible forge built by a grieving father, fueled a weapon of invisible fire. It won the silent secret war. And the mountain kept the secret.